Well, hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. Peter Measroch is a South African-born keyboard player and singer. During the early 70s, he was a member of progressive rock band Abstract Truth. Peter played piano, organ, flute, harpsichord, and sang on the band's first album, Silver Trees, from 1971. In the early 70s, Pete relocated to the UK, where he would cross paths with Chicago-based Daddy Longlegs and play on their album, Shifting Sands. Over his career, Peter has become quite the versatile musician, from the traveling street theater company, the Friends Roadshow, to the Chicago Slim Blues Band. Then came one final move to Montreal, where Pete still resides. There he created electric desert music, helping jumpstart Ray Bonneville's career. He's played with Terry Gillespie and South African expat Lorraine Klaasen. And let's not forget his music for TV and film and his solo recordings. Just last year saw the release of Pete's Live at the Blues Café, and my guest is currently working on a new release to be titled Tonal Tales. Well, welcome, Pete.
Hey, good to see you, Greg.
Thank you. Yeah, literally. Thank you for taking time out to do this and meet with me. Well, take us back to the beginning. Where were you born?
I'm born in Johannesburg,
Okay.
South Africa.
Okay.
And I spent 20 years there before moving to the UK.
Okay.
And then subsequently a couple of months in the States, and here I am in Montreal, basically.
Okay. Well, early on, do you remember hearing music in the household when you were little?
Yeah, South Africa was a very particular environment, because we had the two cultures. At that point, it was very, very racially divided and politically charged. I grew up there during the 1950s and 60s, which was the major period of all the apartheid stuff that went on. And so there really was apartheid. It was a division of the races. And so there was most of the music coming from, most of the black music in South Africa was being heard on radio, and the records were being sold in bicycle stores and barber shops. You wouldn't really see it in the regular record stores.
Right.
And then, of course, there was the whole white scene, which was which was radio, record stores, and particularly the pop culture happened. The hit parade, the top 20 and all of that stuff was originally South African, but when John Lennon declared that the Beatles were now more popular than Jesus,
yeah,
the Beatles got banned on South African radio, and everything shifted over to Lorenzo Marx. LM radio was what we all used to listen to for the hit parade, and that was coming from Mozambique, what's now Maputo, and on the coast. It was a Portuguese colony at the time, and it became so. LM radio was the place for the white rock music fans, and but I was just into, and then of course there was the local Afrikaans folk music, which they used to call it tikkie draai, which meant basically dancing around the coin, but it sounded a lot like Cajun music, but with an Afrikaans twist. And so I used to enjoy that. We used to listen to that in the home. My parents were big classical fans, so we used to listen to classical music, and I used to listen to a lot to the African music, on which at the time was mostly Kwela and township music, and that I would get from either from the radio, the black radio stations, or from the record stores. The musical instrument stores where we could meet and jam with black musicians across the color barrier at the time. So
okay.
it was a very special environment, musically speaking.
Yeah, I've talked to, various UK musicians, grew up
Yeah,
around the same time, and talking about the records being sold like in appliance stores and things like that, before
yeah.
they actually had their own store, they had a little section, I find that fascinating. Well, early on, the piano was first musical instrument you learned to play at a very early age.
My parents tried to start me on violin at 5 years old, and that didn't take. It
Okay.
lasted about 2 lessons.
Okay.
And we didn't have a piano in the house, but my uncle, who was a big political activist, um, later who later got himself into quite hot water with Nelson Mandela and the Rivonia Revolution. He had a piano in his house, and I would go down to his place and bang away at the piano. This was 5, 6 years old, and eventually it got to the point where I was almost breaking into his place to get onto the piano. So my parents
Is that
get out
right?
from the house. And
Breaking
later,
in.
my grandmother, who was had been a very, very good piano player at a younger age, left me her Steinway upright grand when she started to get arthritis in the hands. So, yeah, I had pianos in the house.
Oh wow, that's a nice piano too.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Well, I don't know when a good time was to talk about apartheid. Did you have any personal experience run-ins yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the atmosphere was charged, and I came from a family. My background is actually Irish
Okay.
from my grandmother's side, and the uncle that I was talking about in question, one of my earliest memories at the age of, I guess I must have been 12 at the time, was going around to their place for dinner, and the place was full of policemen and dogs, and he had just been put under house arrest, which
Oh,
meant that he was no longer allowed to have more than one or two visitors at a time. And my aunt had to take the dinner out of the oven and bring it over to my parents' house because we were no longer allowed to visit with my uncle. And this was really an early wake up call for me as a kid that something was not quite right, about
no.
the political situation. And I think I was lucky in that way. So, um, and my parents were always enough on the left as far as that goes to avoid arrest, but marginally so.
Just barely.
And so there was always a strong political awareness from a very early age that there was a situation. And I remember when South Africa declared uh, it became a republic. I think it was in 1960 or 61, somewhere around there. And all the kids went to school and they were given little South African flags. My mother would not allow me to go to school that day
Oh, okay.
because she saw that this was going to be a huge negative for the future of what was.
Right. Right.
So
So
I
she,
mean, this yes, definitely, and I have to say that and this followed me right through until I actually left South Africa because, especially as a musician, it was very difficult to work with musicians across the color barrier, concerts, I remember at one point a concert with the Malumbo Jazzmen in Durban with Abstract Truth, where I seem to vaguely remember we all wore white baboon masks and painted our hands and white so that nobody would realize that there were actually black people in the band, because we played on the steps of the city hall or something. I seem
yeah.
to remember a
You did
concert.
you did the opposite of blackface. You did you
Yeah,
did
we
the
did whiteface. Everybody did whiteface,
white.
including the black guys in the band.
Oh, wow. Oh wow. I can't even imagine fathom,
No, it was crazy
letting
stuff.
letting
Really
them.
surrealist.
Yeah, and I knew that was one of the reasons that you left. I knew leading up to that. Well, you talk about before you actually started playing in a band, some of the artists and musicians that were influential.
Um, well, I started taking classical music lessons very young, and it was that I had a teacher called Adolf Hallis, who was from the European tradition, Vienna, and he, right back to all these and it was a strict classical thing. The girls who had lessons before me would come out crying without fail,
Oh,
from having spent hours on one bar and being, mercilessly. So it was that. It was very strict musical thing, and I got into. I started listening at home to people like Thelonious Monk. I think my earliest influences were blues players like Otis Spann, Thelonious Monk, Dave Brubeck. I remember the Take Five album. Oscar Peterson was a big influence.
Oscar, yes.
All of these people I started listening to. The blues was interesting because most of the record stores ordering blues albums from catalog didn't know what they were buying. So there was a lot of very eclectic Chicago blues stuff, which ended up in the record stores. I know when I eventually went to Chicago, I knew tunes that people said, well, where did you learn that? I said, well, in the record store in Johannesburg, they couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that they were there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a later story, but it was to the point where being a South African playing those blues tunes when I got to Chicago much later, you know how it is with people get a moniker in that city,
Yes.
Dogman, Cadillac Sam, that sort of thing. I was Bushman Piano Finger.
Okay. All right. And has that stayed with you?
No, it hasn't stayed. It hasn't stayed for some reason, but I was thinking, that when I do put out Tonal Tales, I might put it out as Bushman Piano Finger rather than
that would be nice. Yeah, hearkening back to that. Well, was there any kind of music scene developing around you, as when you were like a teenager?
Well, there was definitely a music scene in Johannesburg. There was a big folk scene going on, which I kind of became part of as a teenager. It was centered around two clubs in Johannesburg called the Troubadour, which was a folk club, and Night Beat up the hill in Hillbrow, and there was quite a collection of people getting into that folk scene. Sing Out magazine. They'd buy the Sing Out magazines, and it was all the Pete Seeger, Joan Baez thing, and I got involved in that. Doc Watson came out there, and Rambling Jack Elliott, and all of these people. It was quite a folk scene, and so there was that thing happening on one level. I was playing guitar in the folk clubs at 15 or 16 years old, but the other music scene that was going on, where I would get to meet other jazz musicians, because blues wasn't really happening, or African musicians, was in the records. It was in the record stores, but especially the music stores where they were selling instruments, because people would come in on the weekend, and there it was a mix. They were selling instruments. Didn't seem to be really a color barrier of any sort in the music stores, because people were buying stuff,
Right.
And you'd go into the post office, and the one side was for whites and the other side was for blacks, a little bit like the Deep South in the States, back in the day.
Right.
But the music stores were not like that. And so on the pretense of trying out pianos and guitars and basses and things like that, there was some pretty amazing jam sessions would happen in the music stores. And so there was that connection, there was that contact, and my parents being a little bit on the leftist liberal side of things, sometimes musicians I would meet there from the townships, my parents would go out and sort of clandestinely bring back people to have jam sessions at my place. And this was around 15, 16 years old. I particularly remember a Zulu vibraphone player called Ernest, who was very, very, very influential for me around that time. And then, of course, I was still doing classics until about 17, 18 years old.
Okay. Well, who was Ben Siegel?
Ben Siegel, affectionately known as Zen Beagle to the people,
Okay. I like that you're playing on
I think he was actually the head of SAFMA, which was the South African Folk Music Association. And he looked a lot in his prime like Professor Calculus from the Tintin books.
Oh, okay. I know what you're
with the little
Yes. I know who you're talking
and the
about.
same kind of nerdy look.
Yeah, yeah.
But he bought a 2-track recorder, and he had a house and in central, in one of the suburbs of Johannesburg. And he was, because of being SAFMA, the head of SAFMA, he had a lot of musicians surrounded him. People would go out to his house, and people would record at his house. At that time, you had people like Hugh and Andrew Tracy. You had the International Library of of African Music, and there was all people like Dave Marks from 30M Music, who were out, who who was part of the Ford Jackson at Jill at one point.
Oh, Fort Jackson. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And he was out in Durban, but Ben Siegel was kind of very I don't know how he was an important figure in the South African folk music thing at the time, and a lot of us recorded. There were albums which came out of his house recorded in his living room, and I don't know whether you've been on my website, but there's
Yes.
a little video, and there's also
Right.
that was dedicated to Ben, and there's a recording of Boombalaka, which was with Paul Tracy and myself on flute and stuff like that, and the original version of Old Timer, actually,
Old timer. That's
which
what I
was
was.
one of the first song I wrote during that period as a folkie.
Right.
Happened in Ben's living room, you know. So
And that track Old Timer has been covered a few times.
it's been covered a few times, yeah.
Yeah.
Third year, my publisher is 30M Music. It's Dave Marks, who's still active in South Africa. He's got a whole archive. It's really interesting. He's really been following the South African music scene and archiving it for posterity, I guess, or something. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's good that he does that. Somebody needs to do that. Yeah.
And he's
Well,
gone a lot further than Ben was sort of going in that direction, but I think Dave kind of took it over and went much wider in terms of the music that he was archiving. So that was Zen Beagle.
okay, Zen Beagle.
Really.
Right, right. Well, was let me ask you this: was the Flood? Was that your first band?
Yeah, the Flood. There was one of my very early collaborators and friends was a fellow called Mike Dickman, a really wonderful blues guitarist and blues player. He's living in Paris these days. He's what he does for a living these days is he translates Tibetan texts. He even went on the road with the Dalai Lama, I believe, at one point as a translator, and they send him stuff to translate, you know, from parchment.
Yes.
But Mike's a blues player, and Mike and I started the Flood together. It didn't last very long. We went down to Durban, and Flood kind of evolved into Abstract Truth as Mike and I went down to join what was already Abstract Truth in Durban, and then Mike left and came back to Johannesburg, and so the Flood was a short-lived. We had a couple of musicians with us at the time. I'm trying to remember. We had a Scottish bass player, and there was one other member of the band. I'm trying to remember. The Flood was so short-lived, you know, that it didn't. Well, at least that I was part of it. Maybe it continued under another, another reincarnation of some sort afterwards. But that was the Flood. The Flood was a precursor. We rented this farm outside of Johannesburg called Paddock Farm. Okay. And we sat on this farm and got the Flood together, and then part of the Silver Trees album was written on that property.
Okay. Well, talk about what were the circumstances that led to you joining Abstract Truth?
Well, it was just that we'd been invited to go down to Durban, but I think it was even Dave Marks, because Dave Marks had a club on the beach front in Durban called the Totem Club, which was a popular, they would have cocktail hours and shows and things like that. And there was this, I think Abstract Truth had already done one album. I know that in the introduction you said Silver Trees was the first album, but it wasn't actually. There was a small formation of musicians, a guy called Robbie Pavitt, I think, on drums, and Brian Gibson on guitar, and Kenny Henson, who was later part of Abstract Truth, and Sean Bergen, the saxophone player, who were playing this club called the Totem in Durban. And Dave Marks had this idea of inviting Mike Dickman and myself down to join them, because I think members were leaving. So Mike and I got in the car, we hauled down to Durban, and Abstract Truth. That was the beginning of our incarnation of Abstract Truth, which led to eventually to the Silver Trees album.
How long after you had joined did you guys record the album?
Quite a while, actually. Quite a while, as I recall. What happened was that we played the Totem until that kind of all went south. And then we got in, the whole band got up, and we were very poor at the time. I mean, we were living in a couple of holiday apartments and living on chocolate milk and bunny chow. Bunny chow was white bread scooped out and filled with curry from the Indian market in Durban, and living on this stuff. And eventually we went down to Cape Town, which was down the Garden Route, and nice and all the things, couple of thousand miles in an old van. We spent some time in Cape Town, and there's a few tales from that period as well. Then we came, and then we were offered this contract with, I think it was Polydor at the time, EMI Polydor in Johannesburg, and a producer called Clive Calder. And we all went into studio in Johannesburg and recorded Silver Trees. And actually, that album was virtually written in studio. I mean, when I think about it, I can't remember, other than Silver Trees, which became a vehicle for long and extended and boring jams, at concerts, which people would for a reason I still can't figure out. Most of the songs on that album were written in studio. Everybody came with their little thing. Kenny came with the song "Two," dedicated to his 2-year-old daughter.
Yes.
And I showed up with Silver Trees and Blue Wednesday, and
yes.
I mean, if you know the album at all,
right?
And George, who was writing traffic-like songs, he was a big influence. Came with a couple of things, and poor Clive, the producer, we were on 4-track at a time when everybody was already on 16-track machines in Europe. So it was a challenge because we all had multi-tracking stuff that we wanted to do.
Yeah.
And every now and then be up on the roof for a little bit of a smoke, and then down into the studio, and we would drive the producer totally mad,
Yeah.
Oh, let's do this, let's do that. And he never knew where anything was going. We were in there for about 3 or 4 days until eventually they basically kicked us out, And that was Silver Trees. It was a story of not enough money from beginning to the end. Even the cover was shot in Durban.
Yeah.
And there was a Swiss photographer, a guy called Teek Glauser, who'd invented this amazing technique whereby you would take a photo with a sort of prism across his lens, and anything that moved at the moment of the photo would get this beautiful rainbow around it.
Yeah.
And EMI decided they didn't have the money for a color. He'd shot all this stuff with the rainbow edges. EMI decided they didn't have the money for a color album cover. So it ended up in black and white and all blurry because
that's right.
Everything was out of focus.
It didn't work.
That was the story of the album,
basically. It needed to be in color after all.
Anyway, the good old battle.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I had a few comments, songs and you've already mentioned a couple. In a Space, that has a nice vibe. And my only criticism on this one, I think the sax was a little bit too up front on this one. I think maybe
In a Space was Sean's song.
Okay.
And Sean was a huge Coltrane fan. He was the jazz man in the band.
Okay. So I figured that's why it was included.
And he took this really, so the sax. I think maybe he had his finger on the button in the mix or something like that. But that was
right.
Solo though, I think.
The sax does work well in other songs. It accentuates the songs. Complements. But in this one, I think it was a little bit too forward. Yeah.
I think one could probably offer a lot of mixed criticism because it was done in such a hurry. But there you go. Yeah.
But I think my favorite on the whole album is "Moving Away."
Yeah.
I like the harpsichord. I like that.
Yeah. That's right. I've forgotten about that song.
Yes, really.
Yeah, but it was a treat, because we'd been on the road, and I didn't have much of anything in terms of an electric piano. In fact, I had one of those old farfisas, the gray one,
Yeah.
gray and black one with the gray and black keys and a knee pedal for the vibrato. And it was the cheesiest sound in the world. Maybe there's people out there right now who appreciate that farfisa, but
Yeah.
it was so cheesy, and I was very aware of it, And we get into studio, and in mine, there's harpsichords and there's Hammond B3s and there's all this stuff. So it was like, being let loose at the buffet. And so we had to find a tune for the harpsichord. I think I wouldn't be surprised. I think that song was written in studio for the harpsichord, basically,
It sounds like it, yeah.
or just jamming on the harpsichord.
Yeah, with all those instruments, you're like a kid in a candy shop. Yeah, like you said. Two, that's one that you mentioned earlier. That's not a bad track.
That was Kenny wrote that for his 2-year-old daughter, I think.
Right. And then the one that you mentioned also, Blue Wednesday Speaks. Nice organ throughout, and a blues track, which I enjoyed on that.
Yeah, it was a modal sort of thing, and that was just having too much fun on the Hammond, on the B3, which I never.
Right. How about any memorable live shows? Any stories playing live?
Oh yeah, well, this will give you a feeling for South Africa. I remember on the famous trip that we did down to Cape Town from Durban when we left after Totem. We ended up in some little hick town or suburb near Cape Town, where we were booked in at a club called Rama.
Okay, what a name.
Yeah, I know. And you got to understand that as hippies in South Africa at that time, long hairs,
yeah.
It was a very strange place to be in the culture of the moment, because all the sort of rednecks of the white population, and there were a lot of them, including the police, hated us. It was effeminate, and it was all this scary sort of about effeminate guys and the long hair and whatnot. And for the black population weren't too sure about them either, because we were whiteys, but they couldn't put us into any kind of pocket,
Right.
So you were kind of really an outcast. You were as a long hair during that period. I'm talking 1969, 70, 71 in South Africa.
Yeah.
So anyway, we show up at the Twistorama for this show, and we set up all our gear, and we weren't seen as a progressive rock group at the time. I think we were seen more of a sort of an acid rock group. We were a sort of South African Grateful Dead or something like that.
Yeah.
Pink Floyd, Grateful Dead, something like that. And we get into this club in Wynberg, and it was packed. It really was packed, front to back, because the group had quite a bit of popularity at a certain point in its own little way, And we start playing, and we were really into the material at that time. We would really get into the music, with or without any other aids. It would be eyes closed and out onto cloud nine the moment we would start, because there's a lot of very long improvisation. We'd cover, well, there was tunes like Silver Trees from the album, but we'd also cover Zappa material and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And anyway, so we start playing in the club, and we hadn't been playing we're just starting to get into it. The music is taking us, the eyes closed, we're all jamming away. And suddenly I start to feel my nose starting to burn, and then I get this horrible sensation in the back of my eyes, and my throat starts to tighten up. And I thought, oh my God, I'm dying. What's going on here? And so I say to myself, well, if I'm going to die now, I'm going to die playing music on stage. And so I'm going, this is the way to go out,
Go out like this. Yeah.
So keep playing and I'm waiting for it to happen, but it doesn't happen, you know. And so I think, so eventually I open my eyes and I look at the other guys and they're all on stage. Everybody's dying. Playing their last notes on this planet, you know.
Yes.
And then we look out in the audience and there's nobody there. It had been packed like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
And we think to ourselves, well, what's going on here? The place was full. And then we see this kind of smoke coming up from in front of the stage. And we realize that it's tear gas.
Tear gas, right. Right.
Tear gas. So we drop the instruments. We get outside and we join the rest of the audience who were out there
had left
from the moment. And we didn't know what had happened, how this had possibly happened. And somebody called the police, the local police station, so that they could come and, you know, find out what had happened. And they never showed. Mm. So eventually we cleared the area out of the club. We went back and we did our concert. And about 10 minutes before the end of the concert, same thing. Wow. Except that this time we were ready for it. The side door opens, tear gas gets lobbed into the room. And but this time people ran out to see if they could catch it. And all they could see was the police car from the local cop station driving away as fast as it could.
Right, right. Yes. You knew who was behind
that was South Africa.
Wow.
In 1970 out in the sticks, you know. And that was a memorable concert. I mean, it's a photographic memory for me. The Twister-Rama and the tear gas.
Of course, you can laugh about it now, but at the time,
yeah, sure. Yeah. At the time.
Oh, wow, what an experience! Wow. Did you have any lasting effects? I mean, days after from the tear gas?
No. I think it all happened so fast that, you know, I mean, in my memory, it's of course taken a bit of a proportion, but I think that we actually got out of there quite fast. But the crowd, the place did empty out like it. Oh, yeah. I think people realized right away, that there was a problem, but it was so surreal.
You look at the other guys and they're doing it.
And along the same vein, we had this one I missed it because I had military service to do, you know, the call up and all of that stuff. And so at one point there was a rock festival in Johannesburg where the band was invited to play. And I unfortunately had to miss it because I was in the army at the time doing my 9 months of military service. And we had a good friend of mine who's in Amsterdam these days, a guy called Robbie Hahn, big bushy black beard and hair and all of that stuff. And his friend, and who's another good friend of mine who lives in Toronto. And they were sort of managing the band at the time. And Abstract Truth did this concert at a stadium, rugby stadium, I think it was, in Johannesburg, and a busload of Afrikaner right-wing redneck students from Pretoria showed up and kidnapped them.
Did they?
Physically forced them into the bus, drove them off to Pretoria, roughed them up and cut their hair. They shaved their heads, you know. Finally returned them to the stadium like hours later. And this was a big deal. It was in all the papers. It was like, we're going to show these hippies, you know, what it's all about. And they actually invaded this rock concert and took our manager and dragged him off to Durban. Was like 50 miles away, you know. So and gave him a rough time, cut their hair, and
I don't know if it was Mike Foray. You know who Mike Foray is, don't you?
Yeah, the name's familiar, but yeah.
He's in Chicago. He's from South Africa originally.
Mike Foray, yes, of course.
Yes, Mike Foray. I don't know if it was a story he told or someone else about cutting the hair. Yeah, about that.
You've heard the story from somebody else. It's the same.
Yeah, somebody else referred. I don't know if it was them, the band personally, or if someone else had it happen to them. But
it's part of South African rock legend, you know.
Cutting the hair.
Played on the concert, the Abstract Truth thing. You know.
Well, you didn't stay with the band to record the follow-up. the other album?
No. Well, there was one record called Totem,
Yes.
and then there was I'm not sure that what was the album after Abstract Truth? Was there another album after Silver Trees?
See, that's what I guess some of the
The
quotations.
compilation that was put out afterwards,
Okay,
which
yeah.
was a combination of the two albums. But I'm
Yeah.
not sure that the band stayed together for another album. I'm not sure
Okay.
about
Yeah.
because
Some of the references online have them one way, and others have them flipped. Which one came first? The Totem and Silver Trees. So,
Totem came first because those
okay,
were
that was
not around afterwards. Silver Trees came after,
okay.
and then I think there was a compilation put out afterwards that had songs from both. But
Okay.
as far as I know,
Okay.
when I left for the UK in '71, Kenny Henson stayed on, the guitar player, and then came over to join me for a couple of things. George Wolfhard, the bass player, is now, well, the last I heard was in Amsterdam. Kenny passed away a few years ago from emphysema, and Sean passed away in Amsterdam a few years ago. But he went. I don't think the band stayed together or recorded another album after Silver Trees.
No, I don't think so. Well, you relocated to the UK in the early '70s. Talk about moving there. Was it a little bit of a culture shock for you?
Oh, it was wonderful. It was just great. I mean, no, I went to Amsterdam first.
First, okay.
I went to Amsterdam first, and where Robbie, the guy who'd had his haircut at the
Yeah.
at this involuntary haircut, was working with the Friends Roadshow, a guy called Django Edwards,
Okay.
and the Friends Roadshow, and Robbie went on to become a famous rabbit on Dutch television. He had this puppet personality because Robbie had always been in theater. You know, he'd been a stage manager before getting into being our manager.
Yeah.
And then he went to Amsterdam, and then he was working with the Friends Roadshow. And so I went and stayed with them for a while. And then I moved over to the UK. And in the UK, I went down to visit a friend of mine, a good South African friend of mine, who was a guitar player, sort of along the lines of Bert Jansch, John Renborn. He was into that sort of stuff, you know.
Yeah, bulky, yeah.
Yeah, and he was living out in the English countryside. And so I ended up renting a cottage out in the English countryside. And I found out the next thing I knew is that my next door neighbor on the one side turned out to be Roger Daltrey from The Who.
Oh.
And and next village over was Mitch Mitchell from the Hendrix Experience.
Yeah, that's right.
And there was a whole musical scene going on in this neighborhood, which centered around one particular pub. I'm not going to mention names here, but and so of course Roger and all that tradition had the manor house.
Yes.
And Mitch Mitchell had this big house which he painted purple over in the next village. And there was also an Australian guitar maker called Don Henderson, who I ended up writing a couple of songs with. He was a trade union kind of guy, but he was a guitar maker. He would make about 6 or 7 guitars a year, which were sought after.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, after Hendrix died, Mitch gave him a bunch of the Hendrix Strats, you know, to repair and to do work on. So anyway, so I ended up with Roger as a neighbor. He was getting ready to do his solo album with Adam Faith at the time, and Adam Faith had a guy called Leo Sayer.
Yeah.
So I got hired. There were all sorts of people in the neighborhood. There was a guy, a guitar player called Mick Cox, who used to be with a group called Heir Apparent, who was also living down the street.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And you know, people would come wandering through, people like Graham Bond, you know, and these kind of people. And so I got hired to put a band together for this unknown singer that had been discovered in Brighton. His name was Leo Sayer.
Yes.
And so I got a band together with Mick Cox from Heir Apparent. And also I invited Kenny and George from Abstract Truth over to join me. And we did some of the first shows for Leo at the Speakeasy in London. Hendrix had just died at that point, so
Yes.
I met Mitch, but I got to hang a little bit with Mitch, but I never got to meet Hendrix or anything like that. But he had produced the Heir Apparent.
Right. Right.
He was the producer of that. And so I was kind of I was kind of a bit of an odd man out in those days, So I did the first shows with Leo Sayer and all that, but it was a very cliquey world, I mean, I was basically a hick from South Africa,
Right.
landing in the middle of this situation, and all of these guys. Steve Chapman was the drummer. Another drummer was hanging out there. I think he worked with Van Morrison or something for a while. And all of these guys were up there, and I wasn't only seen as a hick from South Africa. I think I was a hick from South Africa. I was overawed by all of this, because there we were out in the colonies, doing our little musical thing, and suddenly you're in the middle of these people who've basically been heroes, for you.
Well, you got to hear some of Leo Sayer's early material. I like his early singer-songwriter material.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really good. I didn't like him so much when he, You Make Me Feel Like Dancing, when he went that direction. I lost.
This was all his original material. He was writing with a guy called Dave.
Exactly.
Dave. I remember Dave. I remember the two of them. Dave, whatever. I can't remember what his name was. I should, but anyway, they were a singer-song. He was really doing most of the songwriting.
Right.
Both from Brighton.
Right. It's some good material. The early,
some lovely stuff.
Yes.
But I think I only did 1 or 2 shows with them. We practiced for about 3 or 4 weeks, and then did and if I was overawed, Kenny and George were even more so, So I think we were. I think it wasn't really a great match, Mick Cox and us. This combination of English rock stars and South African hicks, for Leo. And so eventually, I think they got a real band together, and his career took off from there. But I think as a sort of, well, I'm saying it now, but maybe it wasn't that way at all, a consolation prize or something like that. Roger said, "Well, listen," he says, "I've got this group from Chicago who are looking for a keyboard player. But more importantly, they're looking for a place to stay." And I had this cottage down the street, right?
That was the ulterior motive.
The Daddy Longlegs all moved in with me to the cottage, and they had a recording contract with Polydor Hamburg at the time.
Okay.
And so we started writing songs and doing stuff together, and going on the road. And
well, what were they doing there? Chicago-based band doing in the UK?
Well, I don't know. The band had already had an album which did quite well.
Yeah.
And they'd lost their keyboard player. He'd gone off to do other things. There was a drummer called Cliff Carrison, a guitar player called Norton Holdeman, who was pretty amazing. In fact, I think he had a few mental health problems or something, because if it wasn't for that, he would have probably had quite a career. I think he's passed now as well. But I mean, just Mitch loved his playing, and that said something. And I remember Mitch would come to some of our gigs, actually. And Norton, at one point, he gave Norton one of the Hendrix Strats. This was after Hendrix died. He gave Norton one of the Hendrix Strats, and Norton, it was a white Strat, I believe, as I recall. And Norton, one day in his room at the cottage, decided he didn't like the color, so he went down to the hardware store and he bought a can of black spray paint. He did this horrible botched job on this Hendrix Strat, which must have been worth like, even then, quite a lot of money.
Right.
And somehow word got back to Mitch, and Mitch came up on stage during one of our gigs and ripped the guitar out of his hand. And
did he? Oh, wow.
There's another concert story for you. But I mean, so they'd had this album which did okay in Europe, and Polydor wanted them to do another album. So I recorded an album with him called Shifting Sands. I wrote the title song on that, and I think there's a version of Old Timer on. I covered my own song on that album with him, with a flute player called Pete Arneson, I believe, who did a nice job. And Shifting Sands, you'll hear Norton's guitar playing. It's really wild rock and roll type stuff. And we recorded this in London with an engineer called John Johansson, I believe, who was the guy who was involved with his partner in at Electric Lady in New York, who'd recorded the Tonto's Expanding Headband album. I don't know whether
yes, I've heard
that rings a bell.
Yeah.
John was over there, and he recorded the band. He recorded that album for us as an engineer in London.
Okay.
And that was the album. That was the Daddy Longlegs album.
Okay.
Thomas Mitz, who was the bass player on that, became a lifelong friend. He was actually a painter and a really good. He's got a website. I think you see some of his stuff on my website. And so I kept in touch with Tom. And when I went back, when he was the guy, actually, sorry, we're into the web of time travel here. But when you did your introduction, you mentioned that I'd worked with the Chicago Slim Blues Band. I never worked with the Chicago Slim Blues Band. Tom had been the bass player with the Chicago Slim Blues Band.
Okay.
And he had all sorts of stories about Chicago Slim, who worked for the sheriff lockup and during the day. Cadillac Sam, who'd been with Al Green, and Bumblebee Bob Novak, who was the guitar player for Chicago Slim, who had who was the guitar collector, which all famous English bands would go over there and look up Bumblebee Bob to find rare and vintage guitars to buy. But I went over, stayed with Tom in Chicago afterwards, and he got me involved in a road tour with a blues player called Luther Allison.
Okay, Luther, yes.
So I didn't work with the Chicago Slim Blues Band, but I did do one college tour with Luther Allison.
Okay.
Yeah,
and it was a bit of a reunion with Sean.
So that was So that was the. I left Daddy Longlegs to go and work with the Friends Roadshow in Amsterdam at one point. They were in London and Amsterdam, so and it was a good band too. They were really we had a bus.
Okay.
A London bus. They chopped the side out of a London double-decker bus with a folding stage. The band was permanently mounted in the top.
Is that right? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Go around and just unpack the bus. We had a show, a surrealist circus show called the Michael Spaghetti Half-Ring Circus.
Okay. Yes. Talk about that. Yeah.
It had Django. Robbie Hahn was with us as well. The same guy who had his hair cut back in. Played a character called the Great Zandu, who would dive off a chair into a paper cup filled with water.
Okay.
He was the Great Zandu, and it was actually a great. It was a great group of people. There was a couple of Marcel Marceau proteges doing mime, a girl called Nola Ray. Okay. And there were a couple of people from the Dutch Royal Ballet, and there was a guy called Jeff Stevens, who had started a group called the London Black Theatre. They were the first people ever to do blacklight theatre, neon, ultraviolet light,
yes.
with day glow, basically costumes,
Yes.
And so the show was great. And the band, Chris Kelly, who'd been with John Mayall for a while, and a guy called Sid Curtis, who later moved to San Francisco, who had something to do with the Average White Band. I can't remember what it was, but so the band was good, and the music was great. And another piano player called Davey Norcott, who was from South Carolina.
South Carolina, yeah. Well, did you guys just pull up anywhere and start playing, or did you have to get it okayed in advance where you would?
Well, we were a theater commune basically. We were a theater commune who were at one point being financed by the Oval House in London, which is a theater organization of some sort. And we were squatting a house in Crystal Palace. There were about 30 of us at the time. And the group would break up, into different splinter units wherever we could find gigs. Sometimes we'd have gigs for the whole show. The bus was put together in London.
Okay.
We'd find gigs for the whole show. Sometimes I would go out and do a one-man show with Django somewhere, or with Nola and Django, you know, a little mime show, or we'd go and do kids parties or something like that with 3 or 4 of us. But the bus was something. Yes, we'd just drive around. Sometimes it was set up ahead of time. Sometimes it was like street theater. We just pull up, and then we went to Tunisia.
Oh, all right. How was that?
Tunisia theatre festivals. We were invited out there. We were the only group I remember the year I went was 1974. It was in Tabarka, there was this big festival, theatre festival from all over. It's where I met my wife, actually. And we were the only group invited by the Tunisian government to go around and do all the small towns of Tunisia, which was really an experience, because there's Roman amphitheaters out in the desert there.
Yes,
And
yes.
I remember, in fact, one show where we'd been driving for hours in the desert, not seeing a soul, and coming across this basically empty amphitheater, and started setting up. There's a picture of this on my website of the theater, of the amphitheater.
Yeah.
And we all said, well, I don't know who we're doing the show for. I mean, we hadn't seen a soul in 3 hours, you know. And suddenly at around 7 o'clock, out of the woodwork or out of the desert, that just materialized. The place was packed.
Yeah.
I never figured out where they'd all come from. It was just amazing. And yeah, that was Tunisia.
Did you take a lot of photos on that trip? A lot of pictures?
Oh no, I didn't really have a camera. I was depending on other people who had the money for cameras and things like that, you know. I was into photography before, but I didn't at that point in my life. I had not much left. A couple of pairs of pants. We were living as a commune, you know. We were
Right.
rattling up money to go down and get a beer at the pub from time to time, but nobody had any money. It was just like we were trying to support. We were squatting a house in Crystal Palace, and 30 of us were living in it, and then squatting in Amsterdam. And after I left, Salvador Dali fell in love with Django and got the whole group to go down there and do
Really? Is that right?
private concerts in Paris at some penthouse that he had or something. I missed that period of
Oh, okay.
Roadshow. Must have been great.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, wow. That would have been something too. Well, we'll talk about when was it that you relocated first to Chicago, right?
Yeah, well, what happened was that at one point we'd done the Amsterdam thing. We had the commune in Amsterdam with the Friends Roadshow, and one in London, and we were working between the two places. But Django was actually from a place called Milan, Michigan, close to Ann Arbor.
Okay.
And his father had sod farms there or something like that. And I didn't realize it at the time, but most of the skits we were doing with the Friends Roadshow was stuff that he'd been doing with his childhood buddies at high school. Milan, Michigan, you know, adapted for Europe, you know.
Yeah.
Like diving in a cup of water, and
Yeah.
you know, the trained rubber chicken and all of this kind of stuff. And so we went back, and he started a little commune out in so he had a group of Americans that had been with him then, and he said, who wants to come with me and start an American splinter group at the Friends Roadshow? So I jumped on that bus, and I ended up in Ann Arbor, basically doing shows with the Friends Roadshow there. But the conditions were horrible. I mean, we were all sort of sleeping on the floor out in the sort of farm out there, and I didn't enjoy the shows very much, because whereas there'd been a real arty cultural thing to the European version of the show, which was, you know, we had really good dancers and mimes and magicians. We had a guy called Alan, somebody from the London Magic Circle, who had an act called the Great Swandini, Swandini. He'd do this. He'd do his act in duck feet, wearing duck's feet, you know, and he was really good. I mean, it was all surrealist stuff, you know. He would do the trick with the bottle and the glass, but then he would end up with so many bottles and glasses on the table. The whole thing would always, anything that he did would just get completely out of hand.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was always like with an edge to it. And so the English show was really good. But we got to the States and we found ourselves playing bars, you know, and doing it was like bar cabaret.
cabaret.
So eventually, my friend Tom said, "Why don't you come over to Chicago, hang out here with me, and I'll get you playing blues." And because he was working with the Slim Band, I actually did end up on stage with him one night. With Chicago Slim would have a gun on stage. He would always be packing, you know. If I bring a piano player on stage, I'm going to shoot him. But you know, didn't happen. Tom will bear me out on that.
Okay,
Around,
that's true. It's true.
Anyway, so then that's how I ended up in Chicago, and I'd met with the woman who's now my wife in Tunisia, and she was living in Montreal. She was French.
Okay.
She had a French theater group, and so
that's why the move to
that's why the move to Montreal. And I was going to just go there for a little while, but the rest is history. Basically, I went there, and 3 kids and 6 grandkids later, I'm still in Montreal. You know?
You're still there. You must like living there. Yes.
Yeah. Montreal's been very kind. It's a great city. You should make it down here for the jazz festival. Or
what time of year? When is that?
it's always the last week of June, first week of July.
Okay.
It's 10 days in that time period.
Okay. I would love to actually. Well, yeah, once you got there, you were able to do some session work and started playing some live shows too.
Yeah, funnily enough, this life catches up with you in funny ways because when I was in England with this thing with Roger Daltrey and all of that stuff, he'd been on tour. He had a guy in his studio recording an album. He had the first 8-track Ampex recorder at the time in his studio out in the barn at his place, Roger did. And there was that, and he also had the first ARP 2600 synthesizer, which I got to play, which was just amazing. And so I did a couple of sessions with him at the barn, and we had a sort of an arrangement because he was recording his solo album. So he said, "You help out on run the board while I do stuff in the studio, and then at night when I'm not there, you can come in and mess around and do your own stuff." So I would do that, and there was this guy Mylon Lefebvre, who was a singer from Georgia who'd been the opening act for the Who on their last tour.
Okay. Yes.
And on that last tour, they had a guitar player from Quebec, French Quebec, a guy called this will come to me in a second. Anyway, he was a guitar player from Quebec who'd worked with him, and I ran into him in a studio session in Montreal when I got here. Somehow, through friends of friends, I went to a studio and he was there. And when he found out that I'd actually knew Mylon and I'd actually been on a session with Mylon, he says, "You have to work with me." I'm going on tour with a French singer called Jean-Pierre Ferland, who just recently passed a couple of...
Right, he did. Yes. Right.
And
I've got some of his material. Yes.
Yeah, he said, he didn't say Jean-Pierre Ferland, he said, "I'm working with a guy who's the Leonard Cohen of Quebec."
Yeah.
The French Quebec.
Yeah.
Okay, so I went out and I did this tour with him, and that's how I sort of got into the Quebec scene. I started working with French singers, but once again, I was a hick and a sticking out like a sore thumb because I didn't have any of this culture. You know, these people were all coming from the French chanson, Jacques Brel, Felix Leclerc, these kind of people. And for me, this was not part of my culture. In fact, I didn't speak French at all when I came to Montreal. Not at all. I speak fluently now, obviously.
Oh, you speak fluent. Okay, I was going to ask you.
But then I was like, 3 words was a lot. And so I was never quite comfortable with these people. There were some stories there, anecdotes from concerts, which you wouldn't appreciate unless you were a Quebec person into the culture. But I ended up meeting some blues guys here called Stephen Barry Band. These guys, And one thing led to another, and I ended up playing blues in Montreal, becoming part of a kind of a floating group of, that's kind of how I ran into Ray Bonneville and how I ran into, and Ray Bonneville, by the way, is half of the year in Texas. He must be a neighbor of yours somewhere down there.
Oh, is that right? I wonder what part, what part?
I have no idea. I could look it up for you, but he's he's in Austin. He's in Austin. He was in Arkansas for a while. Now he's in Austin. You're not quite in Austin, I believe. So
yes, yes.
so that was how it happened. I got to Montreal. I kind of went through the French thing for a while, and then got more into the blues scene. And now I go out and play reggae with Terry Gillespie in Jamaica from time to time.
Yes, yes. Well, I wanted to ask you about the how you became interested in creating music for film, and in particular the children's TV show that you composed music for.
Well, I took a huge detour, because working for French singer-songwriters. In South Africa before I left, I had a lot of good musical experience doing off-Broadway sort of shows there as a pit musician, because they would never have the money to they would bring out shows like West Side Story and Dames at Sea and The Boyfriend and all of these kind of off-Broadway musicals, but they never had the money to bring an orchestra. They would pick the orchestra up in Johannesburg so I ended up doing quite a bit of that, and I was hoping that when I got to Montreal, there'd be some theater or something where I could, play music, but it didn't happen. It was very much a French scene, and I ended up in that French thing, which wasn't going anywhere for me. And I was starting to miss Africa very badly. So I said, I'm going to go and get a degree. I'll go to McGill University. I'll go and get a degree in economics and do development, go back to Africa as a development economist.
Okay, right.
I went to McGill. And got an honors degree in economics, working with the developing area studies people, and playing piano bar to pay my way through this, and playing piano bar around downtown Montreal. And then I discovered that nobody was really interested in a 30-year-old ex-musician economist, in terms of employment possibility.
Right. It's a strange collaboration there.
I realized that the world likes to compartment you a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I started looking around, and I found this guy who was doing I said at this point MIDI had happened, and I had my own MIDI studio, and I was into sampling and all of this kind of stuff. Technologically speaking, I was keeping up with the technology ever since that ARP 2600 back in Roger's studio.
Yeah.
I was into the synthesizers technology, music technology. So I said, I'm going to write music for film. How do I do that? How do you even begin to synchronize music for film? So I started looking around for a gig in post-production. I found this guy who was doing a series of lifestyle videos on Van Morrison, Dylan, all of these kind of things, and he built editing studios in Montreal. And I signed on as an assistant. He was doing a series for Lorimar out of LA called the Shades of Love series, which was the first video to film project. They would shoot in video, they would shoot in film and then transfer to video.
Right.
And it was new technology, right? All sorts of pitfalls, time code, frame rates, all of that kind of stuff. And this is right up my alley. So I got into it. I dived into that, into the deep end of that. And I came out of that months later with sort of unique skill as on the leading edge of what was post-production at that point in time in Montreal. And then the phone started ringing, and it was paying a lot more than music.
Yeah.
So I did a swing into what became a 30-year career in post-production.
Yeah.
And if you look at my site, there's a link. If you go on the IMDb, that's all detailed, all the projects over that 30-year period. But there's a lot of networking involved there. So soon as directors would find out about the musical side of things. Can you write something for this? Can you write something for that? We need a bit of blues in the bar here. We need something here. We need this, that, there. So all of a sudden, I started building up a musical catalog at the same time as I was doing film post-production.
Right.
And the TV series was part of that whole dynamic.
Right. And so
I ended up writing the I've retired now from film since 60s, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And so I'm all music at this point. I'm all music projects, but there was a huge detour.
Okay.
I think my music career would have been a lot different if I'd stuck purely doing music. But maybe I'd be in a poorhouse somewhere. Who knows, you know?
Who knows? Well, what was the name of the TV? I wanted you to say it because I don't think I would say it.
Okay.
Animated children's.
Yeah, it was the series in French. It's called Choupi. Choupi et Doudou, because it was a penguin and his little bear. Choupi, Tchoupi, and Doudou, Doudou. But actually, there was an English version which was on Fox for quite a while, called Charlie and Mimo. It was Charlie and Mimo, Mimmo. They were Charlie and Mimo on Itsy Bitsy Time.
Okay, Itsy Bitsy Time. Okay,
Itsy Bitsy Time for quite a while, but the producers, it was a French director, French concept. The writer of the series, it was a great TV series, really, for 4 to 6 year olds. Nothing like the sort of animation that you see most of it. Very, very out of the way animation. If you Google Choupi, Tchoupi, you'll see it's there. It's all over YouTube, you know, and but mostly in the French version. Charlie and Mimo lived for a year or so on Itsy Bitsy Time, Fox, and then it was gone.
Okay.
So unfortunately, because it was a really good show, and concept in France, drawings in France, coloring in Korea, and sound and music and mix in Montreal.
Okay.
The co-producer was here, so that's how that whole thing happened.
Okay. All right. And how long again did that last?
Well, the show was on. I wrote music for 60 of them, 64 of them. They were 5-minute shows, and that lasted about 3 years, and then it got picked up again, but this time only with they wanted to redo it, but only with French technicians and musicians and sound people for some financing reasons or something. So there's a second series called Choupi and His Friends, Choupi et ses amis, which is quite different, but the same thing. Okay. And the one that I did was Choupi et Doudou, which lasted for about 3 years, and now there's a French one. I think it's still going, actually.
Still going. Okay. And you ran into another expat South African, Lorraine Klaasen.
Yeah.
And you two have collaborated, worked together.
In a way, I've collaborated almost more with her mother, who's now passed. Her mother was a famous jazz singer called Tandy Klaasen, Thandi.
Yeah.
Who was one of 4 singers who were the favorite singers of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And
right.
Since he was always known as Madiba, they were called the Madiba Ladies.
Okay.
So Tandy was one of the Madiba Ladies. There's a photo also of her on my website in my backyard here with me. And whenever she'd come over, I would basically accompany her. But Lorraine was her daughter, who came to Montreal a number of years ago and has made quite a career for herself here, sort of selling the South African music. Something that I tried to do a little bit when I first got to the UK, but it never worked until Paul Simon came out with Graceland, and then all of a sudden everybody was all over it.
That's right.
Nobody could understand or wanted to understand this music until Graceland. Right. So Paul Simon really did quite a service, I think, to South Africa.
He did. What was the English singer that also helped popularize South Africa?
It was Johnny Clegg.
Yeah, Johnny Clegg. That's what I was trying.
In fact, if you go back, let's go a little. Let's whip back to the beginning of this conversation.
Okay.
Ben Siegel, Zen Beagle at SAFMA.
Yeah.
He put out a double album.
Yeah.
Saffma album, and Johnny Clegg is on that album. Johnny Clegg was a few years younger than me at that time in South Africa, but he was getting to be known on the scene as the White Zulu
Okay.
because he was playing really great Zulu guitar picking.
Okay. Okay.
And he was he had that guitar style like down, you know.
Yeah.
And he had a whole thing happening, and he was on one of the South African folk music albums recorded in Ben Siegel's place in Johannesburg.
Right.
And then of course Johnny Clegg, the rest is history, went on to have this incredible career,
Yes.
putting together Sabuko, the group was called, and then Jaluka.
Yes. Yes.
Sabuka.
Yes.
And doing all the festivals, and unfortunately he died.
That's right. He did.
Yeah.
That's right. He did. And he could do that dance too.
Yeah.
Where you pull your leg up over
the gumboot dancing, the mining gumboot dancing. Yeah.
I remember that.
He worked with that he worked well, I think he got that a lot from the Ladysmith Black Mombasa, who were that vocal group who Paul Simon used on his album. Because they actually popularized that whole thing. And it wasn't Johnny Clegg didn't start it, but he really had that down as well, you know, in a big way.
Yes, he did. Well, how about Band X?
Band X has a funny history. It's because Terry Gillespie is I'm still working with Terry, and Terry used to have a band in Ottawa maybe 15, 16 years ago called Heaven's Radio, which was well known here and very popular, and then dropped off the map. Terry had some personal problems or health problems or something, and the band, sort of the guitar player Vince Halfhide and a few other people, you know, and the band was big in Canada, was big in Ottawa in terms of blues. They would do blues, reggae. There's quite a few expat Jamaicans in Ottawa, including Owen Brown, who we work with. He's in a couple of the photos there on my side. Yes. And so at one point I did a show in Van Cleek Hill, which is a little town about an hour out of Montreal. And Terry came to the show, and he called me up afterwards. He says, "We've got to do something together." So we ended up putting together there was a Swiss restaurant called the Granary. Okay. So we started doing a Tuesday night blues thing at the Granary. And this just got bigger and bigger. And then CBC, Canadian Broadcasting, came out and recorded us there and everything. And there was the broadcaster from CBC who said, "You guys have got to play the jazz festival. I'm going to get you in there." So he went off and saw the guys from the Montreal Jazz Festival. And he said, "I've got this amazing blues band. You've got to get them on stage." And the Jazz Festival guy said, "What's the name of the band?" And we didn't have a name at the time. And he said, "Well, this was the guy from CBC who was trying to promote us, you know." He said, the Granary Blues Band." So it became the Granary Blues Band. And that lasted for a while, and then the musicians started to float and things changed, and then Terry started to go out on the road. And I wasn't going out on the road with these people because I had my film business career, you know. So eventually Terry decided that the band was going to be a floating group of musicians, and he was going to call them Band X. Okay. And so that's Band X. But Band X is basically, it's really Terry and a couple of core musicians. He's got a little floating group of core people that when he's in town or when I'm in Jamaica, I play with him. Okay. When he's in Ottawa, he's got other people. He also works in Toronto. He's got a couple of musicians that he uses there, and it's Terry's a wonderful player. Yes, he is. Yes, I like a lot of his material that I've heard. Well, I see that you've taken an interest in the tabla. And I like that. I wish it was used more in popular music. I like the sound that you get from that. I remember one band, another Canadian band. Do you remember the Poppy Family with Terry Jacks? Oh yeah. And Terry and Susan, she's passed away. They had a tabla drummer. The drummer was, and so it was really different for a pop band, you know, using a tabla, but it really made their sound unique, you know. To hear that. Such an amazing instrument. I mean, I didn't realize it when I got involved, but there's so many beautiful sounds that you can get from that. Right, exactly. It's really difficult, and I didn't realize that either. I'm
exactly.
working with a percussion. My teacher is a percussion, a guy who's been through the whole lineage, but he also teaches percussion here at McGill. And he likes to say, and I guess that's what his teacher told him as well. He says, after 10 years on tabla, you can call yourself a beginner. And
Okay.
I've been on it for 9 years now, so I'm not quite ready to call myself a beginner yet, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Oh,
But,
that sounds like something a Zen master might say.
yeah,
After
well,
10 years.
a very Zenish sort of instrument, you know.
Yes, yes, yes. I can hear that. And
But Indian music, I basically got into it because I wanted to understand Indian music too. I'm back on Paddock Farm with Mike Dickman in the days of the flood. We had a half a tabla.
yeah.
We had just the baya, which was the bass drum.
Oh, you did.
I used to spend a lot of time going whoop, 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 you know. I didn't have the other half of it. And I said, and
Yeah.
one day finally it rolled around 50 years later, and I decided I saw firstly, well, the first thing is I saw was Zakir Hussain with with Charles Lloyd and Eric Harland at the Jazz Festival, and I just looked at this. I said, boy, this is bucket list material for me. And the next year I saw Yo-Yo Ma at Toronto, and I said, okay, tomorrow morning I'm going to phone and find a teacher, and that's what happened. That was 10 years ago. So now I've been into it, and it's been a deep dive. It's been a rabbit hole, but it's amazing. Because the thing about Indian music is this: it's a classical music. This goes back to my old strict classical piano teacher. You know, you would spend 2 hours on 3 bars of Bach, and you have everything had to be exactly as written, you know. Whereas here you have, nobody was improvising, but tabla it's Indian music is a classical music that has improvising as 90% of the tradition, and also there's no harmony, there's no chords, there's no C major sevenths and
Right.
D minors. It's
That's
all
very
melody and rhythm, and that's another whole take. And the rhythms are, of course, like incredibly complicated. So it's really something very special to get involved in, learning how to understand that music and to play it.
to play that. Are you planning on using any of the tabla and the tonal tales?
Yes, I am. And also, but I think I think some of the concepts and improvisational concepts are already part of my piano playing,
Okay.
which is mainly the reason I got into it, to just get, after you've been playing piano for 69 years, which I have.
Yes. Right.
You want to get a fresh take on some of this stuff.
That's right. That's right. And speaking of fresh take, the live at the Blues Café, from last year, you played songs for the first time in public.
Well, I haven't since basically the days of Daddy Longlegs and everything. I sort of basically stopped singing for a while. I didn't, and I just felt like I'd stopped writing for some reason, and life kind of took over, and
Yeah. Yeah.
and so it's a little bit like the Blues Café. I'd played with different bands, but Tom Meredith, who was the host who was booking the people, he said, you've got to come back and do a solo show of your stuff. And I said, well, I don't really have any stuff, I had stuff that I was working on, but not songs. I had I've been writing instrumental stuff, like Tonal Tales will be mostly instrumental. But he said, no, I want you to sing stuff. So some of those songs I wrote in the 2 months leading up to that concert. And it was nice because suddenly I said, oh, yeah, sure. It's nice. Get into some melody, write some words, and be a singer-songwriter for a little bit, So it was that's how it happened. And
Well, how did it go down with the audience? Did it go down well?
it went down. It went down great. You listen. That's a live recording. Unfortunately, the recording itself is not amazing.
Yeah.
There was an overhead mic on the stage, and there was an old piano which they tuned up, an acoustic piano, and I had a pickup on the back of it and a mic in front of me, and so it was just a little board out there somewhere. So eventually I recorded onto a DAT machine off the board, and I sent it to a friend of mine in the film business who's a sound genius. I said, do something with this. And he used some technology to try and extract something vaguely listenable. But it's not a great recording, but you get a feeling of it went down very well.
Yeah.
It went down very well. It was very encouraging for me because I said, okay, so this is possible. I can still do a show and keep
Yeah.
people
Right.
interested.
You still have it. Yeah. There
Yeah.
you go. Right. Right.
Music is all energy, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can imagine. I mean, I ask a lot of musicians. I say, what do you prefer, playing live or recording? And a lot of them say both. They can't decide, but the other part of them will say playing live. Playing live.
I think that's really what I think too. I think that's where it's going. And funnily enough, a lot of musicians that I speak to are worrying about the whole AI thing, because there's these programs out there right now that are writing whole songs. I did it with a French singer, she went and
Right.
said, write me a blues, Chat GPT, and
Right.
Chat GPT, pulled out this thing which was like line after line of blues cliche, which it had culled from all of its learning banks. I mean, it was like that joke of, what does the blues man have written on his tombstone? It's, I did not wake up this morning. I didn't wake up this morning. But it was like that. Every line was my baby done left me and all this stuff. And it kind of worked because Chat GPT had managed to get the stuff rhyming and get the meters correct for a 12-bar blues. But if you actually listened to the words or looked at the words, it was meaningless. It was totally meaningless. And so for me, I think that's what's going to happen here is that people are going to get so tired of listening to AI created music that they're going to say, let's go and listen to some live musicians. People actually reacting to each other. Yes, we know for sure didn't come out of the computer. And I think this might be good for live music in the long run.
So. Yeah. I think it's going to backfire. I do, because I think I mean, it's just the early stages of it, but I can tell right off AI versus reality, that with the visuals, videos, and with the music, I can tell right off. It might improve. I hope it doesn't. I hope, like you're saying, it'll backfire, and hope it doesn't go anywhere else. Doesn't try to replace anything.
So I'm very much for live music. I think there's something really magical about what happens when people meet and
that connection with the audience.
Some of the best concerts I've ever heard have been with not minimal audience. Pharaoh Sanders in Detroit with his band. I think there were 3 of us in the audience, including Sean, the sax player.
Yeah.
He was just amazing, and it didn't matter. There was more people in the band than in the audience, but it was the music that was.
Well, I saw a musician who came through Dallas a year and a half ago, maybe, and he was doing these little house concerts. I don't remember what he called it, but different cities, and it was maybe 20, 25 people.
This is a new thing, by the way. I've got a few of the people are doing Terry's doing house concerts.
Also, that is the name for it. Yeah,
and it's a great format.
Right. And the other thing was, the intimacy, and then also after he performed, taking questions, and being able to interact like that you don't get in a big auditorium.
Sure.
So.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a modern version of chamber music.
Right. There you go. Well, this has been very enjoyable. I've learned a lot, and learned a lot about mistakes that I make. No, I'm not.
That's the other nice thing about life, all the mistakes.
Right. That's very true. Very true. And it's what makes us human, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. All right. Well,
very good to meet you, Greg. And by the way, I think you have a great project there. I think it's very impressive. I looked at your YouTube, your channel there, and I just can't believe you've managed to get all these hours of really interesting people up on your site. And I'm honored that you managed to track me down and.
Sure. It's
kicking and screaming.
Kicking and screaming. Right. I can tell already. I can tell that's well, it's been enjoyable. I've spoken, like Mike Foray, and there's a couple of other South Africans. I've got a couple coming up if we can just nail down a time with remember Macaulay Workshop?
Yeah.
A couple of guys, ex-members. and we're trying to get in the same, you know, we're there in the same room together and do that.
At that time were really people like the Otis Waygood Blues Band.
Yes, yes. And I almost had one with one of their members and it fell through. I can't remember the guy's name. You could probably throw his name out, but he's in England. I know he's moved to England, but yeah, Otis Waygood.
And then there was Derek Rabin with Blondie and all of those people, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
So there was quite a period. Johnny Congas, I remember he was a little bit before my time. So was
I did. I did talk. Did you see my interview with Johnny?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, yeah. He's in Austin. Yeah,
He's
see,
in Austin.
and that from South Africa to England to Austin, I'm like, wow. Okay.
Well, that's like that, you know. We don't choose.
Yeah. No.
You make these little decisions in the moment, and you end up somewhere totally different, you know.
Right. And he was very surprised. I think that there's still a lot of interest in his music from back then. He's more pushing his sons, you know, Congos, the band. I think he's got 4 sons that are in the band.
Well, I was amazed that you tracked me down, I have to tell you.
Yeah. Well, I do. I put on my little.
It's like a little blip.
I was going to say, I put on my little detective hat sometimes, and it's fun. That part, tracking people down, and especially when they're receptive to it, really makes it all worthwhile. It does. So.
Well, there's always context to this stuff, you know, and I think that's kind of interesting.
Right. And hopefully it'll be there. I mean, once it's recorded for future generations and that kind of thing, and you know, for sons and granddaughters and so on, you know, can watch it and pass it down. So it's kind of a bio.
Good work, Greg. Keep it up.
All right. Well, I do appreciate it, Peter, and thank you again for your time. And I will send you, once I do edit a little bit, copy of it, and you can post it on your social and see what kind of reaction and comments. You know, that's always fun. All right, we'll keep on pressing on, okay? And all the best to you.
Okay, you too, Greg.